was a long time ago now, but I was thinking about it today, and I was thinking about, I told Bill, like the late 1990s, I said, Bill, I just went to this training about how to talk to kids, and we'll probably do that part 2 tonight. And I said, it's really interesting. I didn't realize he had just started coordinating the training for the CASAs. And so I was telling him about it. And he called me and he said, that was really interesting. And then he called me a few weeks later and said, would you be willing to maybe talk to the CASA trainees about that? And I was like, okay. And I had nothing, but I'd been to this one class. I was like, okay, yep. Sure, and actually that made me learn it better, faster, so I can come and talk about it. So tonight we're going to do 2 things. First we'll talk about poverty, and then we'll talk about just some of the skills or considerations about when you do talk with a child, some of the things you might want to think about. And when I do the poverty presentation, which I was telling Bill I was a little late to set up because I couldn't find it on my computer. And then I pulled up all my PowerPoints, and I now have over 200, and that would be why I couldn't find it. And then I saved it to my desktop, and it's not appearing to be there. So I'll have to find it again, because I know it's in there. Well, and sometimes they rearrange themselves when you look at
Yes.
It should say. I know the name of it now, though. But I like to talk for a minute about Montana Legal Services when I talk about this training. Montana Legal Services is an agency, statewide agency that provides civil, not criminal, legal services to low-income Montanans. And after I finished my master's degree, I went to work at Legal Services. I worked there for 4 years, and I coordinated a family law mediation program because I also am a trained mediator. And I hadn't been there very long. They hadn't had a social worker on staff before. And I said to the director, you know, you guys, we're always with people who are in poverty, but your staff doesn't actually seem to have very much training about poverty. And she said, you're right, develop one. Oh, no. And I said, oh okay, sure. So it was kind of a, you mean you're going to actually pay me to sit here and read and research and look stuff up? It's like being in school only getting money. And she's like, yeah. But what I didn't realize is that when I had the training put together, she like Bill was another person who provided me opportunities to stretch and grow and learn more, because she said this is good, and then we presented it all over the state for a while. Then we presented it to the staff and had it picked apart by all their fine legal minds, and then we took it to some national legal conferences. And so without Legal Services having recognized the importance of information about working with people in our communities who live in poverty, this particular training wouldn't exist. And I think it is important information. The other thing about it is that I didn't invent any of this stuff. All I really did was research, read, and explore and put information about poverty together in a form that is accessible and condensed for all of you. It can be a provocative training. We learned that fairly quickly. I have had people have a variety of emotional responses to this training. When we first started doing it, we learned pretty quickly that we just had to even take some of the information down a few notches because it was so difficult for people to hear for a number of reasons. I've had people get very angry, and I've had people not be able to stay in the room. That's been a rare, but I've had more than one person leave. And then I've had people unable to sit down who have to pace. So I just want to tell you, if it doesn't make you think hard about your core values or make you question some things about what your beliefs are about poverty, then I probably haven't presented it very well. But it isn't meant to be offensive, prejudicial, discriminatory, or unkind to anyone, because all of us pretty much have either lived in poverty ourselves a period of time, or know and love someone who's lived in poverty, or have a family member who has lived or is living in poverty. So that's my disclaimer that I do at the beginning of that training. And now I just have to find it. So you have your, you have got your, maybe it's in my most recent documents because I opened it right before. And we have got until 7:15, Bill?
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you guys might like a break because you probably were all doing things today all day too, besides training. So we'll go through this and then we'll have a break, or we might even have a break during this because it's the longest of the two. So we named this training Client-Centered Advocacy, Skills for Working with People Who Live in Poverty. And it took us a while to arrive at this name, but it's important. One of the things that I believe really truly and more the longer I work with people is that the words each one of us use to describe anything are actually really powerful and important. And so client-centered advocacy, working with people who live in poverty, is notice to you right away that it isn't really it's without much thought that we put labels on populations of people, the poor or poor people. And that when we do that, our brains are wired to make sense out of our environment and to give things labels. We have to give things labels as human beings in order to navigate our environment. But one thing we do with things that make us uncomfortable is give them labels or designations or names that help us distance from the individuals who may be having that experience. And so you shouldn't hear me say poor people or the poor in this presentation unless I am pointing out that that was how someone else described that population of folks. And I'd like you to think about how you talk about different kinds of populations of people in our community and in the international community when you describe them, and how powerful your own descriptions may be in terms of either minimizing or disregarding or distancing yourself from what that experience is for those folks. And this should work. My clicker. Oh, yeah, it's working. That's good. Why do we need to understand poverty? Well, there's a lot of reasons to understand it. First of all, it's with us, and it always has been. And I think a good number of the children that are referred to the CASA program have lived in a family that's in poverty. Not all of them, but probably most of them. And one of the other interesting things about people who live in poverty is that they are the most regulated group of people in the United States. They are, yeah, that's all. But I read that somewhere, and then I was like, oh, I have to think about that, and it's really true. People who live in poverty in our country have the most scrutiny, the most regulations, state regs, federal regs, local regs, in their day-to-day lives, entitlement programs. They are the most regulated segment of our population in the United States. So therefore, it's very important to understand poverty, because an awful lot of policy and law is based on on oversight of that particular group of folks who are living without enough resources every day. So just think about that, because once you start to think about it, then it gets pretty scary when you start to realize how much policy and law in the United States and in our own state are driven by poverty. Mm-hmm.
Do you define poverty based upon the national level of income or whatever, or is there some other definition that you use? Because it always seemed to me like it might not apply completely in Montana, given that wages are typically lower here to begin with.
I have some other whole bunch of information about what poverty is. Okay. Yep, and I haven't updated it. Last time I updated it was last spring, but we should still be okay because we're still in 2011. So the first thing I learned when I started researching was poverty terminology, which I just made a screen about it because it cracks me up. Because this all means pretty much the same thing, but when there is a large body of academic research about poverty, and these are some of the terms I came across right away: intergenerational economic inequality, intergenerational poverty transmission, persistent or transitory poverty, generational or situational poverty. And I do have to say that tonight we're going to talk much more about generational poverty than we are about situational poverty. Generational poverty is defined as a family where parents who grow up in poverty have children, raise their children in poverty, and then their children have children. So it's 2 generations or more. And it is a very different kind of poverty than situational. Situational is generally brought on by a life event or an act of nature or act of God. Divorce, death of a wage earner, Katrina, hurricanes, earthquakes, and generally, not always, but generally, a person who was not in poverty prior to that event is thrown into poverty, but returns to or near to their prior economic level within 5 years.
So it's kind of more transitory.
It's
also
transitory. It can be pretty extreme, but people who were not in poverty and then have something happen so that they are, also go into that low economic status, usually with more education, more savings, more assets, more friends and family who have savings and assets that they will lend them, and a much better support system. Generational poverty folks don't tend to have that safety cushion. Intragenerational economic mobility was one of my favorites. so I just like to show you that. Because it's there. How do we define poverty? The federal poverty guidelines for this year are what you see on the screen. $22,000 for a household of 4. When you go to the federal websites, there are a number of different agencies that actually do define poverty and make guidelines, and all of them can be slightly different. So I go by the one that's the Public Health and the U.S. Public Health and Human Services. And they change these every year, so they'll change shortly into 2012. Then, the second thing I learned after all those fancy terms was poverty and low income are not the same thing. Now, in our community and in most communities, you will hear people who don't work directly with people who are living in poverty use low income and poverty interchangeably, but they're not really interchangeable. The poverty line is usually, so it's easier to say, to be low income, you're usually 150 or 200% of the poverty line. You either have half again as much or twice as much as a person at the poverty line, depending on which program is scrutinizing your paycheck and what you need.
It's still not enough,
Right.
really, to live comfortably or even
No.
make the ends meet.
Right. But these are important for any program, energy assistance, WIC, public assistance, all that stuff. Let me go back. I don't have a screen about it, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the poverty guidelines got made, because that was the next thing I learned. And it's kind of complicated, so I hope I can find my note. Where did the poverty guidelines come from? In 1963, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, working with the Social Security Administration, decided that they needed a poverty guideline. So they assigned a very nice lady, whose name I have in here somewhere, but because I was disorganized today, I'm not going to find it. So they assigned this very nice lady to figure out what poverty was. So she put together a formula, and she took all of the expenses of an average family of 4 people in the United States in 1963. So housing, transportation, food, utilities. She assumed that for some reason all of those expenses had to take a drastic cut. She assumed in her formula that all of those were cut at exactly the same percentage. So the money for the housing wasn't any more different of a cut than the money for the food or the money for the transportation or the money for the utilities. This was the assumption in the formula. She assigned all of the categories in her formula a dollar value except for food, for some reason. No one knows why. And I actually think she was charged with an insurmountable task, and I have no idea how she even set out to do this. Someone had to start somewhere. And then she came up with the 1963 federal guideline. Probably that's because the Kennedy administration was working on the social legislation that came out of his administration and President Johnson's administration, the Great War on Poverty, and they had to have somewhere to start. But I used to talk a lot more about that, and then one of my peers said, Dana, really, there was no one in there who really knows President Kennedy or the Great War on Poverty. It's like, okay, I'm going to stop using that reference, but I'm thinking you guys might.
We know.
Good, thank you. So now, since then, people, so Health and Human Services looked at that, took that number, and adapted it. And it's been scrutinized and twisted and turned, but I have to say, I think it's pretty important, like you brought up, what exactly is poverty? That was a fairly arbitrary place to start. And it's had a tremendous amount of power.
And has it been
Tweaked?
shifted, tweaked, manipulated over
sure.
time?
Yeah, but it's really not gotten a whole lot better.
No.
So,
Not
I mean,
much.
so, really a family of four in Helena, Montana, $22,350. So assume 2 adults and 2 kids. That's not very much money. For rent, housing, transportation, clothes, and if you want your kids to be able to do activities or take lessons or sports. Or
Can't do
shoes.
that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, clothes, right. It's very, very difficult. So it's the history of that. My bachelor's degree is in history, so I always have to figure out how things started before I can move forward with them. And to me, that just seemed kind of arbitrary. But we all look at it now and give it a lot of, I mean, it's like, oh, sure, that's the poverty line this year, okay. Really, we could pick a different number if we wanted. So that's kind of how that came to be. Poverty in Montana, there's a great website, National Center for Children in Poverty, nccp.org, that I use for this. And this is where I'm pulling from a lot of different sources for this information. And they update their data on Montana and all the other states every year. Sometimes we have asterisks by the Montana data because our population is still so small. We have under 1 million people in the state still that they have to say this was a small population, so it's a little bit of a guess, but pretty close, I think. So 17% of our kids live in families in poverty. 42% of our kids live in low-income families. You're more likely to be living in poverty if you're under the age of 6, and a little bit less likely if you're over the age of 6, depending on younger siblings. And mainly, I think the factor there is that kids go to school at 5 or 6, and parents can work more and know the kids are in a safe setting. 14% of children who are above low income live with a single parent. 70% of low-income children live with a single parent. So it's not rocket science. Single parenthood is an indicator of poverty. This is an important screen. So 25% of children in families in poverty have at least one parent employed full-time year-round. And the other one may very well be home because it's less expensive than doing child care.
Can't afford daycare.
Right. So it's someone's working hard 40 hours a week full-time, year-round. 42% of children in poverty have at least one parent who's employed either part of the year or part-time. So in Montana, I think what's significant about that is we have a lot of seasonal industries. And so a person could actually have a skill in Montana that gets paid pretty well for 3 to 6 months of the year. And then literally that job is unavailable again for the next 3 to 6 months, depending on weather conditions and all kinds of other stuff. And so they may draw unemployment or they may not. So a third of children in families in poverty don't have an unemployed parent, which means they may have one parent or two parents, but they're in poverty and their parents are working. No one's unemployed. And this is a number that changes. When I first started doing this in 2004, the number 15% was 11%. 11% of children in low-income families do not have an unemployed parent, and now it's 15%. the thing about that, when I was a child protective services worker, which I did for just short of 8 years, the belief, well, and since then in a lot of my other roles in the community, people really believe in our community that families who are living in poverty like it and really don't want to work. And I just have to tell you, that's so not true. It's really so not true.
Who believes that?
I've heard, I think that's true.
Oh, yeah.
People think that
They
about
do.
folks who are in poverty.
You know, and I read based upon some early conversations in one of our earlier things, a whole lot about generational poverty, so I've been down a lot of what you're saying here.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it seemed to me that it's maybe not that they just don't expect to.
And you know, that's one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Okay.
And that's also something about generational poverty is that living without adequate resources becomes a norm.
Yes.
So if it's how your grandparents grew up and your parents raised you, you don't actually have much idea of how it would be to do it any
Well,
different.
plus you're spending all of your day-to-day resources,
Surviving.
capacities to just survive
And
and
what-
get
and-
by, and
Yeah,
you can't dream
that's right.
or have big goals.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk about that too. So in my experience, and I'm sure there's probably some research out there that backs it up, families where there's a parent or parents who aren't working have got other really significant barriers. They are compromised in their physical health, they're compromised in their mental health, or some combination of those things that prevent them from actually having what we would consider gainful, normal, full-time employment. But a lot of those folks, just anecdotally that I've worked with, had jobs where they were paid under the table. They would seek places in the community where they could do something for somebody to get paid for that was outside of the norm of what we think of as a paycheck with insurance and tax deductions and things like that. So it really wasn't that they weren't trying. They're just in a different economy. The last one is also not rocket science. Children whose parents don't have a high school degree are much more likely to live in poverty. Just getting that high school diploma really reduces your odds of being in poverty as an adult, and that your children will be. 8% of children in poverty live in families with no parent present. So what do you think that might mean?
Foster homes,
Foster homes, adoptions,
on the streets,
yep,
Right.
homeless,
yeah,
homeless kids,
or yeah,
couch surfing kids.
that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
So not living with grandparents, that would not
No.
put them in that
and they
category.
could actually, that would
Yeah.
fit,
That
into
would fit?
being raised by
Okay.
grandparents, aunts and uncles, but no parent is present. Parents are deceased, parents are missing, parents are incarcerated, or simply just across town but not able to care for them. And then only 2% of children who are not in poverty live in families with no parent present. The other thing that's really, really important, and you guys will see this in your CASA caseloads, is mobility. A family in the United States that lives in poverty moves an average of 2.5 more times a year than a family that does not live in poverty. And so what do you think some of the reasons for that might be?
They
Can't
gotta
afford
get,
it.
can't afford
Where
their,
they're living, yeah,
Yeah,
following the job,
following jobs, can't afford where they're living,
maybe
having kids with medical problems.
having kids with medical problems, living in substandard houses to start with without any
Yeah.
secure rights as renters, or in houses where landlords can just say, you're out tomorrow by 5.
Or month to month.
Month to month, yeah. And so, only 12% of kids in families that are not in poverty move that often. So think about what that means for just about everything for a family. If you had to pick up and move 2.5 times more than anyone who had enough resources, every time you move, what are some of the factors?
Deposits, yeah.
Money,
New schools and everything.
new schools, new way to get, somehow to get, even if you're only moving across town,
How to get.
you gotta get your stuff over there
Right.
somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I was on the school board in Helena for a long time, and they actually track in all of our school buildings mobility as one of the statistics for every school population. Our schools that have a lot of kids who are living in poverty have much higher mobility rates. So the number of children that start the school year at that school and finish in that school are much diminished. I'm not quite as facile with those numbers because I've been off for about 2 years now, but I think we have one school that actually had a 60% mobility rate.
60?
Well, yeah, 1 year, and I don't know if it stays that high, really high. So the transitory nature in a classroom, just think what that does, not
That's
just for the
disruptive
student,
for the class.
teacher, for the
Yeah.
yeah. So mobility is huge. Children who grow up in poverty have an average of 1.4 years less in school, even if they do graduate. Now the obvious one is that they all quit halfway through their sophomore year, but that's really not. It's really not that simple. I've watched a lot of kids who have mobility miss the last month of a school year because they move in May and there's no point in starting at their new school. The family can't get them back to finish at the old school, so they just sit out and wait until school starts again. I've seen families arrive near the end of a semester and had the school district say, you know, there's a new semester just about to start. Why don't you just go home and bring them back in a few weeks? I've had families who couldn't, for one reason or another, get their child to school for a few weeks. So you start to add that up over from kindergarten to being a senior in high school. They're missing over a year of school. About 30% fewer of children who live in poverty get through high school. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I double checked this and checked a bunch of sources on it because numbers aren't my best thing. And this seemed odd, but I think it's true. Adults who work full time can still live in poverty. A 2-adult household with adults who are working hard, minimum wage for 35 hours a week, nearly full time, can still be living below the low income line or in poverty. And the 35 hours a week is because a lot of those jobs, they won't hire you full time.
They want to pay benefits.
They don't want benefits, right. And a lot of times too, I think these families where both adults are working, the adults are working oftentimes more than one job.
That's what I was just going to say. Montana is one of the highest states with folks who have multiple jobs.
Yeah.
Which might be.
It is.
Yeah.
I know, yeah. So, so they work approximately 250 hours less per year and for approximately 363 less per hour. And that's in a book called Understanding Poverty, which is a really easy read.
All right, less than what group?
Which group?
You said they work average 250 hours a year less and make $3.63 an hour less. Then what group? People with high school diplomas?
No, then people who are above
poverty?
low income. People who are above the low income line. Yeah.
Above the low income line,
Yeah.
above the poverty line?
The low income line.
Okay.
And actually, Understanding Poverty is one of the more advanced research books. It wasn't one of the easier to read books, but he had a lot of economic research and facts in there that I did find borne out in other sources. But I wouldn't say it's a fun read. Usually I bring the books with me to show you. So then the impacts of living in poverty. Are you guys familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody know what that is? I'll talk briefly about it. There was a psychologist who, if you go to school and study psychology or social work now, it's one of the theories you have to learn, who developed a theory that human beings have to have safety, so your body has to be safe, warm, clothed, and fed before you can tend to anything else in your life. If any of your basic securities are missing, you will be unable to move on to the next task that might move your life into something other than just worrying about food and shelter and safety. You just, as biological beings, we cannot tend to anything more than that if our safety is compromised or our health is compromised. And so then, really, if you're in poverty every day, and you wonder if you've got enough food to get your kids through the week. Are you going to be able to tend to a social worker telling you, I need you to go to counseling and work on your emotional issues?
No.
That just adds to it.
That's stress
That's
to
exactly
you.
what happened.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
it started
I
it.
need you to go to a parenting class. Okay, but I'm gonna run out of macaroni and cheese on Wednesday, and we don't get food stamps again until next Wednesday.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna be at a parenting class with that, huh? It's like, can't do it. And I have to tell you, as hard as it might be for any of us to imagine ourselves in that situation, if you put any one of us in a situation where we did not know that we had enough food to get through the next 48 hours, or that we were gonna have this time of year warm enough shelter, we would not be able to tend to anything beyond that. We really wouldn't. And so when you work with families who are in poverty, and they do things like miss meetings, or don't quite get the same importance that you think there is to this going to the therapist to work on the emotional issues, or going to the parenting class, you really need to stop and think through, where are they on the continuum of Maslow's hierarchy? Because even if you're looking at them and it doesn't feel to you like they're in survival mode, if they believe they're in survival mode, you can't make them do anything different.
Well, that's all they can
Think of
That's
Yeah.
the best, the highest they can survive.
Yep. Yeah, and that would happen to any one of us.
And
We're
it's-
not
and
any
even
different.
even, I mean, seniors, too.
Yep, senior citizens, absolutely.
Well, how do those needs get addressed, you know, through, in like a case where the person
not.
needs counseling, but they need food too?
Well, you
Probably
have
get
to
addressed, but not
prioritize.
met.
Right. Well, so if you have a mom or a dad and their kids are in foster care, and they've got a treatment plan that says they'll get a job, they'll secure safe and clean, healthy housing for the kid, they'll go to counseling and work on their emotional issues, you're really going to have to actually do what I call a graduated phased process. You can't ask them to work on all of those things at the same time, because they really won't be able to do it, and they won't make it on the treatment plan. And neither would you or I, if we were really living in generational poverty.
We're just setting them up for a fall.
You're setting them up for a fall. So you have to kind of help the social workers, depending on the worker, recognize this treatment plan may or may not be doable.
Is that part of not piling things on and
Yeah.
not raising the bar
So
too
like
high,
too fast.
too
And then what
fast?
the social workers will tell you, and justifiably so, is we've got timelines, guys.
I know.
And I think you've had folks here that have talked about the timelines. Yeah, you've met my friend Marcy, and I don't know if you've met Carolyn yet. Yeah. And so that's really important. Some of the other things that are an impact of living in poverty, and remember, mostly generational poverty, ongoing day-to-day stress. Ongoing day-to-day stress. You know, so you have enough food right now. Imagine, and maybe some of you are familiar with this, imagine having to tell your kids, here's what we get to eat today. Don't touch anything else in the refrigerator or the cupboards, or we're not going to make it to the end of the week. And imagine having to tell them that when they're this big, and then when they're teenage boys. Imagine. Because I have 3 boys. Imagine. And then imagine coming home from work and finding out one of them did. Because why not? They're hungry and they're kids. And they ate the loaf of bread with the butter. And now there's nothing for lunches. Because all you had was peanut butter and jelly, and what are you going to put it on? Ongoing stress. So meeting basic needs. One of the interesting authors that I read, and some of you might be familiar with her, is Dr. Ruby Payne. She's an educational PhD person. She's written a number of books on poverty, mostly from an educational perspective of having children in poverty in your classroom, but not all of it. She's expanded on that. She has a business called AHA, mainly because when you read her work, if you've worked with families in poverty but you didn't understand some of the dynamics, you read her book and go, oh, I saw that happen, which I did do when I read her book, so I threw her stuff in here. She is very controversial, however, because she describes, one of her books is called The Culture of Poverty. and she describes poverty in and of itself as a culture. And in general, we tend to think of cultures as a country of origin, a color, a skin color, a language, possibly a religion or a faith community. And she said, no, poverty, generational poverty is a culture. And it's got all of the earmarks of a culture, including a language, and I'm going to show you how that works, and she does it. She's very poorly received by Native Americans. And I one time went to do this training right after I read a 20-page white paper written by some very prestigious researchers just taking her apart. I was like, oh, I should never have read this right now before I have to go do this, because I spent that whole training going, but that might not be true. But I keep her in there because I'd had the ahas when I read her work and had worked with people who were living in poverty, and I didn't have the insight into, on the day that you can't feed your kids, you're going to miss your meeting with your social worker. And it isn't because you're being defiant or difficult, it's because you're trying to figure out how to get food for dinner.
And so is your experience that these folks will actually just say that is the reason why, or
No.
try and cover it up, though?
No,
More
because
or
really
less.
if you're in survival mode, are you really going to even do that?
Probably not.
No. If you don't know where your kids are going to get food that night, all of the social niceties go out the window until you've got your hands on that food.
Aren't there other resources they can tap into to get?
Sometimes, and actually that's kind of what we'll talk about next. So the one of the assumptions that we make in the United States is that if we hand someone in poverty money, that it will solve the problem. But it doesn't really, and that's part of Ruby Payne's research too, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But what really makes a difference, if you're a person living right on the edge all the time of your basic needs being met or not met, is relationships. It is not a dollar bill that's going to save your day when something's gone way south. It's going to be a person. And you need to maintain relationships in your community, your accessible community. So say you don't have a car, so this is a community you can reach only on foot or on a bicycle. That's going to have somebody in it on the day you come home and your teenager ate the loaf of bread that was supposed to last you for now there's nothing for lunches for school or whatever it is. You have to be able to get a hold of somebody who's going to say, oh yeah, we'll share our food with you until you get your next food stamps. That's it. It's relationships. And so maintaining those relationships gets pretty tricky, and I'll talk more about that too, because in a community of poverty, as per Dr. Payne, there are a number of assumptions in the community, one of which is everybody will share everything. And if you are not doing reciprocity and sharing with your neighbors and the people in your community of poverty, that when you need to make that phone call for help, they will not help you. And I actually watched that play out time and time again with my clients. The other thing in that community is there's always someone with a greater need than yours, and in a really interesting sociological way, those communities will decide who has the greatest need that week. And resources will get directed to that person. And so you have to maintain relationships in order to actually get your needs met in a way that those of us who have adequate resources really don't.
Just one more stress.
Yeah. Well, it's really ongoing stress. So we all know the health challenges of living in poverty. Depression and anxiety in the literature are often described as being invisibly combined. They're invisibly combined with poverty, meaning that depression and anxiety go untreated and undiagnosed. What comes first? Living in poverty and being depressed, or being depressed and then being in poverty? It's a little bit chicken eggish. Reduced literacy problems and increased mobility we've already talked about, but reduced literacy is really interesting because I had an experience when I was mediating parenting plans at Child and Family Services. It took me a while to figure this out, but in general, I'd have a dad and a mom at the table, and we would be working in mediation to get a parenting plan that they could agree on, and then we'd go through it and make sure everything was just right, and they would each sign it. And when I initially started as a mediator there, I would actually have a laptop at the table. We would do it word for word. I'd print it out, bring it back 2 copies, and ask them to read it and tell me if it was what we had written down. the men who could not read well or at all would just turn it over and slide it back over to me and say, "Oh, I trust you." And then I'd be like, "All right, why? It's not my kid that we just made this plan for." And the women would get mad and say, "You gotta be kidding. I'm not gonna read this right now, right here. I'm leaving. I'm not doing this right here, right now. This is ridiculous. I'm gonna go, and I'll let you know when I've read it." And they'd leave. And I'd be like, "Well, that didn't happen. We were doing fine. Everybody was pretty..." So, and I had it happen, I mean, literally the same behaviors. And one night I was sitting, because I do these mediations in the evening sometimes, so people didn't know, and I was sitting there and this happened and I went, "Oh, they can't read it."
So how'd you deal with that in
We
the
stopped
future?
doing that. We
Okay.
read
Read it out
everything
loud
together, every
together.
single word out loud, and it made an amazing difference. Only one, in the 4 years I did mediations there, only one man ever said to me, "I can't do that right now because I can't read fast enough or well enough to read this document here at the table with you." No one else ever admitted that they couldn't read, but I did go back around after I figured it out and ask a few of them very respectfully, "I'm sorry, I think I really was out of line. Do you have trouble reading?" And person after person told me yes. And so if you see those behaviors when you're with social workers and kids, and you see people asking a parent or expecting that a parent's going to have literacy that they don't, you probably need to say, "Hang on, wait a minute, I want to read that with her. I'm going to read that with him." You don't have to say to everybody, "I don't think they can read," but you can facilitate that written information is actually getting delivered to the client in a way that they can, because they're not dumb, they just can't read it very well.
Or either if they can read, they're not comprehending it.
Yep. Because of the language, which is another
Yeah.
really interesting thing. When I was at Legal Services, because the clients are all low income or in poverty, they worry a lot about how their written materials are developed, and they were just starting to work on that when I left. There is a type of language called plain language. The Vistas sometimes know about it. I don't know if it's come up lately, or but there's a plain language computer program actually that will tell you what grade level any piece of writing is at. And in order for most Americans to understand a document, it has to be written at 6th grade or lower. And it is extraordinarily difficult. If you start trying to write even a brochure to describe a program, you plug in one 3-syllable word or one word with an abstract content, and it shoots it up. Everything else ceases to matter, and your grade level goes up, and then you have to start all over. So, but critically important. It's another thing that way words are powerful. How you write things down for your clients can be critically important. You just don't have to use jargon. Use the simplest, most straightforward kind of language that you can use. And then the other one, which we talked about, living in poverty may be a norm. All the way through all the literature, and generational poverty is kind of what you were describing. Most of us default to our own families that we grew up in to learn how we do things, how we're going to parent, how we keep our house, how important various things are to us or aren't to us. People who have lived their entire lives and raised their kids in poverty and have lived every day without what a middle-class American would consider adequate resources, have done that pretty successfully. Kids are still here, they're growing, their lives are proceeding, everybody has all the same life celebrations and sadnesses that everyone else does. Weddings, babies come, weddings happen, people become ill and die. All the same holidays are joyous or stressful. All that same stuff, but they do it with a diminished number of resources. So if you grow up that way, that sense that something is wrong may be completely absent. As a matter of fact, one of the things Ruby Payne points out in her books is they may find it quite offensive when someone not in poverty looks at their life and says, "How do you stand it, and why don't you want something better?" Really genuinely offensive. The same way that we would find it offensive if someone who lived in a penthouse on Park Avenue in New York, came and looked at our life one day in Helena, Montana, and said, "How do you stand it? How could you not have like 4 or 5 vacation homes?" And you know, really. And I think she's right about that. I think it's extraordinarily judgmental when we approach families in poverty, and we start, and your young social workers are going to do this without question, with the assumption that that family must know something's really wrong and they must absolutely want it to be different. It's really offensive. The things that matter and important to them are no different than the things that matter to people like me who have a 2,400 square foot house and a bunch of cars in the driveway. The joys and sorrows and celebrations, they're all the same. So it's really important to just think about that. One of the things that's not an impact, with poverty being the only factor, and the reason I put this in is because I've heard educators, sadly enough, talk about it in ways that worried me. Poverty in and of itself does not impact a child's intelligence, does not impact their cognitive abilities to learn. It is the collateral damage and the collateral things in poverty. Parents who may both be working 2 to 3 jobs each to keep food on the table and the roof over the head may not come home from work and manage to play a board game and read 5 books to their preschooler before they put them in bed at night. Parents who have untreated anxiety and depression may come home at night and drink or smoke pot or do something to medicate their undiagnosed mental illness, and then they may not parent as well. If you're getting adequate calories, just in terms of being full with food every day, but inadequate nutrition in terms of it all being a healthy balance of calories, it might be a little bit harder to think in school. So I think it's very important to know being in poverty in and of itself does not impact a child's ability to learn. It makes me crazy when I hear teachers say things about kids being in poverty and therefore not doing well, because it's really just not that simple.
Doesn't your ability to learn increase with time as you, based upon your experiences and your reading and you know, in addition to nutrition? I always thought that as you progressed, you know, onwards and upwards, that your ability to learn increased.
There's a continuum for all of this. If you're not really malnourished, then probably. If you're really truly malnourished, then no. You cannot learn when you're hungry.
Yeah. Wow.
And I mean, it's kind of like asking somebody who's in significant chronic pain to learn something new. In the way that it would be delivered in a classroom. It's not going to happen because they're going to be too preoccupied with what else is going on with their body. So these were 3 themes, and this came kind of in phase 2 or 3 of developing this training. I started to notice some themes in the literature, the different sources, and it really boiled down to these 3 themes. And David Shipler, who wrote a book called The Working Poor, which is a really very eminently readable, interesting book, pointed this out in his foreword, in the beginning of his book. So I think there's 3 American myths about poverty. And I think that those of us who grew up here probably had one or more of these pretty powerfully presented to us over and over as we were children in the public education system, in our families, in our churches, in our communities. Maybe one, maybe more than one of these.